We've spent some time thinking about how we can measure the responsiveness of buyers to changes in the firm's price. In other words, how we would measure this price elasticity of demand. What I want to think about now are the various factors that affect whether that responsiveness of customers is going to be large or small. In other words, whether demand is going to be relatively elastic or relatively inelastic. One of the most obvious things that we want to consider is what the alternatives are for our customers. What kind of substitute goods are available? So the more substitutes there are, the greater the elasticity of demand that we could expect. Let's just consider a very simple example of substitutes to see what I mean here. Suppose that our firm is a radio station and it sells time for advertising to businesses. Now, from the point of view of those customers, what are the substitutes? I would think it would be advertising on other radio stations. So that would be substitutes that are provided within the same industry that our firm is in, namely radio stations. But there could also be other, perhaps more distant substitutes, advertising sold by other industries. I'm thinking of newspaper advertising. Advertising on the internet, of course, is a growing thing, and other sources of advertising. And remember, of course, what we're doing is a simple thought experiment in which only the price of our good is changing and the prices of these other substitutes are being held constant. Of course, we need to remember that doing without is also a kind of substitute. So we have to ask ourselves, even if there aren't other kinds of substitutes available, even if we're just purely a monopolist, we're the only seller of this particular product, perhaps the buyers could simply do without. Another important consideration is time. We have to ask ourselves, how much time do our buyers have to adjust to the price change? How long does it take them to respond? In general, the more time that customers have, the more substitutes they've got, the more flexible they can be in responding to a price change. Let's just think of a simple example. Suppose the price of electricity were to go up. In the short term, people's responses might be rather limited. Suppose you live in a house that is heated by electric heaters. You could turn down the heat. Maybe you could try improving the insulation of your windows, and so on. A longer-term response might be to retrofit your house to make the whole house more energy efficient. In the very long term, people might start building smaller and more energy efficient houses to use less electricity. People could also buy more energy efficient appliances like refrigerators and other things which use electricity. So you can easily see that the more time there is for people to adjust to a price change, the greater the response is going to be. So the price elasticity of demand, in other words, typically grows over time for a given increase in price. Another important idea is summarized by the term switching costs. So if our firm raises its price, we have to ask ourselves, how easy or how difficult is it for our customers to switch to some substitute product, to switch to something that another firm is selling? If our customers face costs of switching from us to someone else, then clearly that could be advantageous. It may take time, for example, for them to search out another supplier. It may take time and effort to figure out what that supplier has to sell and at what price. Another example of switching costs involves the time and effort that it might take to learn to use another product. Years ago, for example, the university used a piece of software that was called Blackboard, and that was a substitute product for the D2L system that we're now using. As you may have discovered yourself, the D2L system is fairly complicated. It takes quite a while to navigate your way through it, to learn how to use its various features, and that's even more the case for instructors. So there were considerable switching costs in switching from Blackboard to D2L. A lot of people required training, took quite a bit of time for faculty to get used to the new system. So you're not going to make that decision to switch from one product to another very lightly. You're going to need some real incentive to do that. So that's just another way of saying that the elasticity of demand is not going to be very high if there's high switching costs. Well, finally, another thing that we have to think about is how important is that product to the buyer? How much of their budget are they spending on it? In the case of electricity costs, for people who heat their homes with electricity, that could be pretty high. So if the price of electricity rises by 10%, they're going to notice that, and they may take some action to try to respond. On the other hand, for example, if the university bookstore raises the price of pencils and pens, many students really may not pay very much attention. They don't spend much of their budget on pencils and pens. So in that case, you might expect the price elasticity of demand to be relatively low. Well, let's just quickly consider a specific case. Just giving you an example of two products, two books in this case. In each case, we're starting at the same price and imagining the price going up from $20 to $35. But in the case of this cookbook, the responsiveness of quantity demanded is much larger than in the case of the textbook. I've just calculated the elasticity values for you. So you could ask yourself, well, why is the demand for the cookbook more elastic than that for the textbook? What would you say? I think it's pretty obvious that the demand for the textbook is going to be more inelastic just because there are fewer closer substitutes in all likelihood. There are lots of books offering recipes and advice about Chinese cooking, and there are also lots of textbooks about managerial economics, but as you may have experienced, sometimes it's pretty important to be using the textbook that everybody else is using in a particular course. So there are costs of using something that's a somewhat different book in this case. Well, I want to turn now to thinking about why it would be good for the firm to have a relatively less elastic demand for its product compared with a demand that's more elastic. And what I want to do is to show in some detail why it's better for profits to have less elastic demand.